Good morning, children. Today we'll be learning a new lesson for class 9 Biology Chapter 5 Pollination and Fertilization. The process pollination or the definition and all you might have learned in lower classes. Still then we will be learning the definition, the types of pollination, adaptations of pollination, agents, etc. in this video. So let us understand what is pollination first of all. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains. The pollen grains are produced in the anther, that is the male reproductive part of a flower, to the stigma of a flower. Stigma is the female reproductive part. So transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of a flower is known as pollination. This pollination is categorized into three major types, namely autogamy, geitonogamy and allogamy. Autogamy means auto means self, gamy means marriage. So self marriage, that means the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower, then it is known as autogamy. Geitonogamy is also type of self-pollination. There the pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma of another flower of the same plant, that is geitonogamy. So these two, autogamy and geitonogamy, are of self-pollination, coming under self-pollination. The next type of pollination is of allogamy. Allo means other. That means pollen grains are transferred from anther to stigma of another flower of another plant but of the same species, then only the pollination may be effective. Then only we can say that is the pollination has occurred. Pollination is occurring, but rest, the reproduction and so on will take place if the pollen grains are transferring on the same species. So there are various agents which helps this type of pollination, namely wind, water, insects, birds, etc. So kinds of pollination in detail. Self-pollination. Self-pollination is of two types, autogamy and geitonogamy. Autogamy means pollination which takes place in the same flower of the same plant. Geitonogamy means pollination within different flowers of the same plant. So in certain type of flowers, namely known as cleistogamous flower, that means the flower is not opening at all. There is no opening of the flower, that it is not blooming. Like this type of flowers are known as cleistogamous flower. That is, example is a pansy is an example of cleistogamous flower. There the pollination, the shora, only the mode of pollination which can occur in such type of flowers, that means flower remain closed all the time, that is always self-pollination, and here the self-pollination is said to be cleistogamy. Example is pansy. So when all this self-pollination can occur, self-pollination can occur if the flower is bisexual. Bisexual means both the male and female reproductive parts are present on the same plant, that is stamen and stigma, or the male and female reproductive parts. When it is present at the same time, in unisexual flowers also it can be possible, but the unisexual flowers, that is male flower separate, female flower separate, but both of these flowers should be present on the same plant, then there is chance of self-pollination. And another one condition is very essential for self-pollination. That means anther and stigma must mature at the same time. If the anther and stigma is not matured at the same time, there is no chance of self-pollination. So these are the conditions and the type where self-pollination can occur. Then now let us understand what are the advantages of self-pollination. So what may be the advantages? Advantages, if the flower is of bisexual, there is self-pollination is much surer. We can assure that self-pollination can take place if the condition is also ensuring, that is maturation at the same time. Then parental characters are preserved. There is no transfer of pollen grain is taking place in the same flower or same different flowers of the same plant. So parental characters can be preserved. There is no alteration of parental characters, no chance of alteration. Then another one important advantage is that no wastage of pollen grain. Pollen grain is not wasted. Okay. Then flowers need not be large and showy. Flower need not attract the agents like insects, birds and all. Like in cross pollination, that is very essential. Then only these organisms are attracted towards the flower and pollination can take place. But here no such need is required, like large and showy flower. No, the flowers need not be large and showy, and flowers need not produce any scent or nectar to attract again the agents like animals, birds, insects, etc. So by this the plant is having advantages, is great mean of great economy for the plant. On the part of the plant is great economically benefited. That means there is no need to spend its nutrient for the production of pollen, lot of pollen grains, nectar, scent, large petals, showy petals and so on. So the plant is economically benefited. So these all are the advantages of self-pollination. So now let us understand what are the disadvantages. There are certain disadvantages too. Which are they? Let us understand. Disadvantages include it may lead to weakening of the variety, because continuous generation after generation the self-pollination takes place, so that there is chance of weakening of the variety. Chance not, it leads, usually obviously it leads to the weakening of the variety. And the weaker or defective characters we cannot eliminate, because the same flower it takes place, there is no change. So weaker, if there is any weaker or defective character is there, that cannot be eliminated. And it does not yield any new varieties. There is no mixing up of any genetic material or genetic difference is not there, so that there is no production of new varieties. So these all are the disadvantages of self-pollination. So now let us understand cross-pollination, its advantages and disadvantages. Cross-pollination is also known as allogamy. There the pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same species. Here advantages, what can be the advantages? The offsprings, that is the newly formed ones, are always healthier. New varieties can be produced. The seeds produced are abundant and viable. Viable means viable means the ability to germinate. Pollen grains can germinate on the stigma. So these all are the advantages. And here also many disadvantages are also there. Then which are the disadvantages? Pollination is not always certain, because some pollinating agents are always required. So it may or may not be available at the proper time. So there is no surety like self-pollination. Here it is, pollination is not always certain. Pollen has to be produced in large quantity to ensure pollination. So there is a chance of wastage of pollen grains. Then the process is uneconomical for the plant. Why? Because the plant has to be produce flowers, large showy flowers, nectar, scent, etc. to attract the pollinating agents. So economically it is not benefited, uneconomical for the plant. So these all are the disadvantages. So next part we will be continuing with the next video. Okay. Thank you.